Could one of the most beloved heroes of the last century have just one more thing to contribute to this millennium? Very few TV characters have been as persistent or resilient as Lieutenant Columbo, LAPD homicide, across 4 decades and 2 television networks. From those first 45 mysteries on NBC to the not always stellar 25 remaining on ABC, and spawning one of television's least requested and most mind-boggling spin-offs. But there were 2 real-life Mrs. Columbos, 2 very different Mrs. Columbos. But believe it or not, actor Peter Falk's relationship with his family may have a lot to do with what happens to your family during, say, a national health crisis. Do we have the right to visit our families when they're in the hospital? When they're experiencing their final hours? Do they have the right to see the people that matter most to them? Do the hospitals have the right to withhold that? Does anyone, the government, a church, what gives anyone or anything the right to do such a thing? Well, before today's TV detectives ever got a clue, there was a guy who completely broke the mold and rewrote the entire playbook. His name, of course, was Peter Falk, and he matters on this topic because this topic mattered to him. He shot to international stardom, of course, playing Lieutenant Columbo, not in a whodunit, but in a howdunit. Many actors have a cause, something they care deeply about, and for Peter Falk, ironically, that was making sure seniors weren't taken advantage of. Ironic, perhaps, because as his own mind and body slipped away and he was later placed into conservatorship by the courts, his 2 adoptive daughters from his first marriage claimed that his second wife, withheld their father from them. And it launched one of them on a quest to change the law. It's not a new issue, of course, and like most legal issues, it can take forever to resolve, celebrity or not. Case in point, it was recently reported that Brad Pitt's mother hasn't seen her own grandkids in over 4 years until, the courts can figure out what's good for them. They say possession is 9/10 of the law, so who has custody matters. Whether it's a lost dog, found treasure, or your mom, apparently. And who decides what happens to you or your loved ones, where it happens, and when it happens, is maybe not always who we'd like to think. The denial of access that Falk's daughters recount, it echoes what's happening today. People cut off from their loved ones in their very last hours of life. It's grossly disrespectful to the living and an unforgivable thing to do to those dying. It's a mistake, of course, that can't be undone, missing your shot to say goodbye. Something people globally are suddenly facing like never before, as the family of a TV detective from the 70s fights for change. Man, can you imagine how young and vibrant? Oh, you don't have to. Here's a snapshot from their Syracuse University days. He, the dashing Mr. Falk, and she, the beautiful young Alice Mayo. By all accounts, she was an amazing woman, an accomplished pianist, designer, artist, and more. The two would eventually grow their little family by two, with older daughter Jackie and younger sister Catherine. Both parents were highly intelligent and unapologetically artistic, each graduating from Syracuse University. She got a master's in music, and get this, he got a master's in business administration from the Maxwell School. This after spending 6 months working the Yugoslavian railroads, as you do, and before applying to the CIA. But then the theater bug struck, leading to off-Broadway, Broadway, then more Broadway, before launching into a film career that often gets overlooked simply due to his iconic presence on television. Did you know that in just his first few years, he became the very first actor in history nominated for both an Academy Award and an Emmy in the same year? He was also the second person to accomplish that, which he did the very next calendar year. Among his terrific film work, it's A Mad, 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 Mad World, Murder, Inc., A Pocket Full of Miracles, the hysterical Murder by Death. He worked alongside longtime friends Ben Gazzara and groundbreaking director John Cassavetes in Husbands, and who could forget his work with Alan Arkin in The In-Laws and Big Trouble. Serpentine! And if you haven't seen the screwball psychic comedy Vibes with Jeff Goldblum and Cyndi Lauper, well, you could do a lot worse on a Saturday night, believe me. But let's get back to his amazing family story and the unique parallels that keep him connected to this brave new world we find ourselves in. While it's true that each of the Falk daughters were adopted, this, of course, in no way should denigrate their bond. And in a world where many fall absent-mindedly into parenthood, these two Beverly Hills jet-setters chose to share their success and grow their family through adoption. I mean, it's admirable, no? And whether he was on location in Boston or Berlin, San Fran or Santa Ana, Falk always made a point of sending postcards back home, so they never forgot he was thinking of them. And Alice herself was routinely described by friends and family as warm, generous, caring. One can only imagine how that translated to her own daughters, to whom she instilled a love of poetry and nature and a deep sense of gratitude and appreciation. They had much to be thankful for. Their father's success as a film star afforded them a lifestyle many could only dream of. But hold on to that 90210 zip code, because things are about to get a whole lot swankier. Because Peter Falk was about to shift from a mere two-time Oscar nominee to a household name and an iconic presence. In a role, ironically, he said from day one, he'd kill for. A deceptively disheveled Los Angeles homicide detective named Columbo. In two made-for-TV films, each essentially a dry-run pilot and each a smash hit in the ratings, well, this led into a semi-regular new network concept, the Mystery Wheel, whereby Columbo films would rotate alongside similar shows, thereby sidestepping the normal 22 episodes per year, a grind Falk had little interest in participating in. The show would run initially on NBC for 7 years. Life was good, and it was a good long run. On hiatus, he'd travel and make films. And while on the set of one of them, his eyes fell across an exotic beauty named Shara Denise. And in relatively short time, she became his second wife, as well as the only actress to feature prominently across several Columbo mysteries. It was a head-spinning new reality for producers, old friends, and mostly, of course, his own family, leaving many feeling down and out in Beverly Hills. By the day of their wedding, Columbo, the NBC series, was quickly winding down production. That year, Falk's new wife would appear as bank fraudster Eve Plummer, aka Mr. Milo, assisting killer Louis Jourdan in only the least of his crimes. This after appearing pre-marriage in the previous season, presumably shoehorned in at Falk's request, that time as a secretary mistress to her much older TV producer boss. Such very odd casting in an episode dripping with show within a show, inside jokes, and obvious parallels to reality. One has to wonder what Alice must have thought, seeing this suddenly recurring guest star. In her future roles in the ABC mysteries, she'd advance to a woman sharing her husband with two other brides, another fraudster, and a full-fledged accomplice to murderer Dabney Coleman. Sure had a theme going. Her ability to play tough, hard women who were, what's a nice way to say this, financially territorial, may have gone a ways in typecasting her. But reading different accounts of what their reality on the home front may or may not have been like, well, it can put a little bit of a different spin on her episodes. And that reality, according to his daughters, is that Catherine and Jackie quickly saw less and less of their father. Catherine was just about 6 years old when her dad remarried, and she explains that despite his efforts to maintain a loving relationship with both daughters, such attempts were met by, quote, constant interference from Shara. Some apparently describe the husband and wife as the Fighting Falks on the LA dinner party circuit, where public squabbles became something of a calling card. Meanwhile, the show had ended, the lights faded, and in the slow years that followed, the girls headed off to school and slipped into a routine of making the best of it. Relevancy, they say in Hollywood, is like day-old fish. It won't last. And some characters are so big, so dynamic, it's hard for people to see them as anything else, really. But that was okay. He'd made his millions, and he'd made his mark. Columbo on NBC came to a close in May of '78, and for 11 years, life was a lot less relevant for Falk, despite never hurting for work. He wasn't entirely the full icon yet, because back then when a show ended, it ended. You couldn't dial it up on Hulu, and torrents were still just a fast-moving body of water. People still remembered those episodes, especially the true gems, and they praised it. But back then, revivals weren't really a regular thing. But then ABC unearthed the wheel concept with new protagonists backing up good old Columbo. And so in February of '89, he dusted off the old rumpled raincoat. Well, he probably didn't dust it off. Returning to his role, this time for ABC, and this time spanning 14 years. More so than its predecessor, the new series relied heavily on contrived mysteries and bizarre gotchas, and utilized music and story elements foreign to the series. This included basing a handful on Ed McBain novels, one of them missing a murder. But then there were no more Columbos to shoot. Falk wanted to, despite some health issues. But with who? The TV executives he'd known, well, those guys are replaced like houseflies. And of his original series creators, William Link had long since retired, and Richard Levinson sadly left us in '87. And so the revival ended, and throughout much of it, Falk's first family felt relegated to watching from the sidelines. Not exactly welcome, they say, in the couple's new Malibu home, and with tensions still quite high among warring factions consisting of the people he cared most about. His choices and priorities being his own, at least one biographer called him to task as an unfaithful husband and an absentee father. But still, The heart wants what the heart wants.
And I love playing them. The problem is that I never had a partner. I mean, Columbo worked pretty much alone. And I never had anybody that I could have quick fire, back and forth, love-hate dialogue with. I had a wife, Mrs. Columbo, but the problem there is that she never showed up on the screen. And the other problem is that Columbo was crazy about her. And me, Peter, there she is. I'm crazy about my wife.
Falk's youngest, Catherine, became the most vocal challenger to Shara once her father's health began declining, and really since the very start, come to think of it. They'd always butted heads and would ultimately wind up doing so in court. And Catherine was a formidable force. Raised that way by her parents, she'd grown into a strong, striking, independent woman, a marathon runner, in fact. Good thing she was fighting a wealthier opponent who had the law on her side.
Live from Los Angeles, welcome back to Good Morning La La Land. And we're here talking with Catherine Falk. You may know her famous father from Columbo. And we're talking about equality and our rights as human beings. We're talking about the Falk Bill. Tell us a little bit about that.
My father's second wife, when my father became incapacitated, isolated my dad from my sister and I, so we couldn't see him after his hip surgery. And my sister and I were really upset. And so then I had to go to court and spend close to $100,000 just to see my dad, to say goodbye to him. And it was really traumatizing. And I just turned to my attorney at that point in 2009 and said, we need to draft some legislation and do something, because it's crazy to have to come into court and spend $100,000 just to ask to see your parent and say goodbye, you know? It wasn't about the will. It wasn't about, once somebody's incapacitated, you can't challenge a will anyway. And so that was not even on the table. It was just about like having the right to see your parent before they die.
Children of divorcees are expected to get over it and accept the romantic partners of their parents. Doesn't it work the other way around too? Aren't the new spouses supposed to do the same? Falk's assistant from 68 all the way to 81 said the only time she recalled seeing Shara and the daughters in the same room was at the couple's wedding. And whether you're in La La Land or wherever, should you really have to go to court to see your dying parent? Especially since the hard truth is the institutions involved are indifferent to you. They are all about policy and what they characterize as expediency. Falk's daughters say they weren't informed when their father was hospitalized when he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. They claim to have learned about his death from the press and that they were disinvited from the funeral. Shara's attorneys argued in part that father and daughter had been estranged for many years. This as both sides fought for conservatorship. That's when a court designates another party to be in charge of the financial and legal decisions of an incapacitated person or a business in shambles. Ultimately, the court did what the court usually does, which is stick with the status quo. It awarded conservatorship to Shara. Though some visitation rights were ordered 30 minutes at a time at a house down the street. So what's about those of us who don't have $100,000 or months to wait? Truth is, there's not really much you can do besides maybe fight for a national protocol. Because even in times of non-national emergency, you can be prevented from seeing a desperately ailing loved one by hospitals and/or authorities. And there's a pretty good reason for that, of course, to protect individuals and the greater community, and arguably something of a precedent. We ask young men going off to war to sacrifice their futures. Is this all that different? But try telling that to someone who's dying and terrified and surrounded by cold machines and antiseptic strangers. And if you do ever find yourself in this predicament of denied access, maybe the first name you should think of is Peter Falk. As in, is my state one of the states that's enacted a Peter Falk Law? To her credit, many point out that Cheryl was a very devoted wife who remained at Peter's side during a very difficult decline. Catherine was so impacted by the experience that she started an organization to strengthen state laws to include visitation and information rights for family members. So far, Catherine and her organization have been successful in passing some version of the Peter Falk Law in 15 states, all in an effort to do something to help curb neglect, isolation, fraud, and even abuse. Shara has a cause too. It appears to be the stray animals of Beverly Hills. But don't go judging. They were married for over 30 years, and if the show taught us anything, it's that none of us are perfect. And certainly not in the City of Angels. Falk left us in 2011, but I like to think he's still out there. Still humble, still rumpled, and still chasing Robert Culp.
One other thing.